tonight. I hope you got a chance to enjoy the Adults Night Out. It's going to be a monthly occurrence, so we hope you come back and join us. Excellent. I'm glad you enjoyed it. My name is Tara Harris, and I'm the Vice President for Conservation here at the Minnesota Zoo, and we're very happy to have you here. I'd like to first take this opportunity to thank Minnesota's Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment for making tonight's event free for all of us. So we're very appreciative of that. And we'd also like to thank our media sponsor for this series, MidPost. So please be sure to check out their Earth Journal blog, which covers environmental issues in the news with a special emphasis on solutions to environmental challenges. If you've missed one of our speaker series talks, you can now find them on our website at mnzoo.org, and tonight's presentation will also be recorded there. And now I'd like to introduce our two speakers for tonight. We're going to have a focus tonight on prairies, both talking about butterflies and bison and the Minnesota Zoo's work on those species. And so first I'm going to introduce Tony Fisher, who will speak second. And Tony, you can raise your hand really quick. So Tony is the Minnesota Zoo's Director of Animal Collections, and he's also serving as our Interim Director of Biological Programs. Tony joined the zoo in 1986 as a zookeeper, where he worked in the Children's Zoo and later on the Northern Trail. He was promoted to the zoo's farm supervisor in 2000 and later to the zoo's animal collection manager in 2003. He also serves as the coordinator of the Asian wild horse species survival plan, and he received his bachelor's degree in captive animal management from Metro State University in St. Paul. And first we're going to have speaking Dr. Eric Rundquist, who's the butterfly conservation biologist here at the Minnesota Zoo. He joined the zoo in 2012 and has developed a really incredible program for prairie butterfly conservation, and that's what he will discuss this evening. He's passionate about prairie and pollinator conservation issues and is frequently called upon in our community to speak about these issues. He got his bachelor's degree from the University of Florida and a PhD in ecology from UC Davis. So please begin by welcoming Eric tonight.
Well, wow, what a great audience. This is fantastic. Thanks for coming out. Is it working out yet? Are we on? Yes? No? No? I can speak loudly if needed. Are we on now? Yes? No? No? Okay, maybe I'll use this in the meantime. Okay, I can use this. Oh, there we go. Okay, yeah, so I'm Eric Rundquist, and I'm so happy you're here, and I'm happy to be here too. So as we say at the Minnesota Zoo, our mission is to connect people, animals, and the natural world to save wildlife. And that last little bit, to save wildlife, was just added in the last year as a really important piece to really emphasize what we do centrally here at the Minnesota Zoo, and that's as a conservation organization. And we also say that we are for the big and we are for the small, and just all ranges of life are important to us. And this really is exemplified tonight when we talk about the biggest animals of the prairie, the bison, and the smallest, some of the butterflies, and the ones we're working with right now. So, if you want to learn more about our conservation programs, both internationally and here in Minnesota, check out our website, mnzoo.org/conservation. And I want to talk to you now about prairies, and I've got some of the prairie plants up here, but most people don't actually have a good reference point for what prairie actually is in Minnesota. These are rich, rolling landscapes, and many times they're glacially carved, at least the last pieces that we have. This is Glacial Lake State Park in central Minnesota, a really beautiful spot, and you know, we are also the land of many, more than 10,000 lakes. There's plenty of them on the prairie too. And again, they're very rich botanically. And that's actually one of the more important features of why we need to save them. Besides being home to all these rich species of animals, they are also tremendously diverse in the plant communities. And those plants really anchor down the soil. And so here is me for reference. I'm roughly 6 feet tall. I can reach about 7. Well, I can reach a little more higher than that. But so many of the tall grass prairie plants that we have are 6 or so or more feet tall when they're full grown in late fall or late summer now. But what's even more impressive is how deep in the soil those plants go. Those roots can go down 10 to 15 feet, and they really hold on to soil really well. And as soon as we remove them, we have tremendous erosion problems. And so we want to be able to think about this underground forest too as a really important piece. And all that anchoring of soil has really helped produce the dramatically rich soils that we depend on for modern agriculture in the first place. And just for reference, that little circled spot right there, that is Kentucky bluegrass. That's everybody's lawn. So that only goes down, a couple inches. It really does not have the ability to hold on to soil very well. So that's your reference point, and that's why we love prairie. So historically, Minnesota had about a third of its state covered in prairie. There's these areas in yellow. It almost looks kind of neon, almost green here on the screen. But roughly the southern third and western of the state. And that's the historic extent. What is remaining now are just these tiny little fragments in red. Only about 1% is remaining. As a result, now instead of these vast oceans of grasslands that went on for 1,000 miles north and south, from Canada to Texas, Illinois, Indiana, over to the front range of the Rockies, we're really now just talking about these little fragmented islands all over the place. And when the next piece of prairie is 15 miles down the road, and you're in a patch of prairie that's the size of the zoo parking lot or the size of the tropics building, if you're an animal or a plant, you're just not going to be able to get to the next spot. And that's a real problem for, not only the bison that disappeared from the landscape around the same time the prairie also disappeared, but for the little butterflies that don't migrate. Now everybody knows about the monarch. Everybody loves the monarch, and I love the monarch too, but it's not actually the major story here. Monarchs are one of those butterflies that are really quite rare in their ability to get around. They can migrate massive distances, so those individuals we had here a couple weeks ago and were born here, they're now making their way through Texas and even starting to enter Mexico for hibernation. They've already flown that distance, and they're going to spend their winter in Mexico and then breed and get back to about Texas next year. Then their offspring are going to get to about St. Louis, and we'll see their grandchildren. And then we'll get a couple generations here, and then they'll go back. So every late fall, we kind of get the great-grandchildren of the previous ones that went to Mexico. So it's a really phenomenal biological event. But they can get around. They can get to those prairie patches. So they're kind of lucky. We also know, though, that monarch numbers are dramatically down. They've dropped from about, this is an estimation of the number of individuals hibernating in Mexico. And you can, instead of counting every single individual when there's millions or billions of them, we really have to think about the size of the area that those hibernating colonies occupy. And they've gone from about 10 hectares down to just a couple in the last couple of years, and even less than that. So it's like the size of a football field, sort of an amazing, poor size. So that's down about 80% in just the last 2 decades, maybe even more. This year was actually pretty good. I expect it to maybe even double from there, but still, we're talking historically low levels. So justifiably, there's a lot of concern about monarchs out there, and we want to be able to help them. So if you didn't grab it, do grab it on the way out. There are seed packets of swamp milkweed, which is admittedly a bad name because it implies it loves swamps, who likes a swamp, and it's a weed. It's a perfectly native happy plant. But you can plant those and provide the only caterpillar food sources for monarchs. So feel free to plant those, and you can even put those on the ground right now, and they would be starting to germinate next spring. But I want to talk about the other guys, the ones that are in even more trouble than just monarchs. And so in Minnesota, we've got 15 species that are on the state's endangered, threatened, or special concern list. And 10 of these 15 are all prairie butterflies. And 2 of them, the Dakota skipper and the Poweshiek skipperling, were just added and protected federally. I'm going to get more into them in a minute, but it's all of these that we need to be worrying about and watching. The monarch does not have a protected status anywhere. Among these spectacular butterflies are the regal fritillary. This is a beautiful prairie butterfly. It's one of the most majestic butterflies out there. It's actually doing okay. It can get around a little bit. It's not doing terribly. It's actually one of those that's holding relatively stable. We don't have the worst populations in the world. We don't have the best. It's essentially extinct east of the Mississippi River, and it depends purely on those prairies. One of those that's even a little more difficult to find is the Pawnee skipper. I've only seen about 5 individuals of these in my lifetime, all on the same hill in late summer. So we don't know much about this butterfly and its current distribution, but we know that it's dramatically declined. But now I want to introduce you to 2 major actors here. One is the Dakota skipper. Again, this is a Minnesota endangered species and was just added to the US threatened species list. And we want to credit Joel Sartori here as he's a photographer with the National Geographic, and he's gone around to zoos all around the world photographing endangered species as one of these stark reminders of all the diversity that's being lost. And he's come here a couple times and photographed some of our collection. The Dakota skipper, the historic range here is in yellow, from old records around Chicago, all the way up into southern Saskatchewan. It's now gone from about 3/4 of these historic localities, these dots that are in red, that we knew they were there, now they're not there anymore. And some of these remaining green dots, those are probably not known well, and some of those could also be gone as well. In Minnesota, we think we've only maybe got 1 or 2 populations left. It's gone extinct in the southern portion of its range, and these locations down here are extinct, so we think that may be the only one that's left. The populations in Northeast and South Dakota are probably the best in the world, but we don't know a lot about the ones in North Dakota either. Then the Poweshiek skipperling. Now this is one you want to remember. Just added to the Minnesota endangered species list and the state, or the US endangered species list. Had a similar sort of range, here in yellow again, and this one has disappeared dramatically, gone from at least 95–96% of its historic range, probably more. And intensive surveys of the last known localities, there's some here in Michigan, there's the one in central Wisconsin, and one just a few miles over the US border, over the Minnesota border in Manitoba. If you add up all the number of individuals seen at these locations in the last, per year, it's about 150. So we're seeing like, oh, there's one, and that's a confirmation that it's still alive at its site, but that's really all we're seeing in some of these spots. It's a really dramatic disappearance, and what we want to emphasize is that throughout its historic range, and Minnesota had half of it, it was one of the more predictable butterflies out there. It was common, it was not remarkable. It was remarkable only when it disappeared. It was like a blue jay. You don't think much about it until, like, I haven't seen a blue jay in 10 years. It's that kind of an idea. So this makes Poweshiek skipperlings way more endangered than a giant panda, for example. There are about 1,600 wild giant pandas in the world, in the wild. Compare that to a couple hundred Poweshiek skipperlings. And if we compare it to an animal in our own zoo, there's still fewer of them in the wild than there are the Hawaiian monk seals. There's about 1,100 in the wild for Hawaiian monk seals. So the Minnesota Zoo stepped in 2012 and launched the Prairie Butterfly Conservation Program, working with many, many, many partners to start thinking about ways we can help out, potentially using the role of the Minnesota Zoo as an expert program for maintaining endangered species. And again, many, 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 many partners. We are currently funded mostly by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. We've had legacy support. We just got a grant from the AZA. Evada and Maury's have given us other in-kind support. And again, we work with lots of tribal and government partners. So what we're doing is trying to, one, establish insurance populations. And in the beginning, it's just trying to figure out how do we even take care of these guys and would it even be feasible to do so? So what we do is working under permits with our partners. We go out to some of those sites, we find the females, and as long as we find enough individuals in the wild first, we can start collecting small numbers of females, bring them back to a cozy hotel in South Dakota, for example. It's really high tech. Put them in little cups under lights, and the females will start laying eggs there. There's a female, there's some of her eggs. And we put in the grasses that they need, so these are all depend on these prairie grasses. That's the only thing the caterpillars can eat. And then we provide them food with these like Q-tips with Gatorade and honey solution basically. And then after 2 days, after we've taken good care of them, we bring them back out and try to put them as close to the same flower we got them on in the first place. So the hope is that we can collect some of their eggs, but not all of their eggs. They can still be out in the wild and living free. And now, this is one of your awe moments. We bring those eggs back to the zoo and take care of those babies. And so here is a Dakota skipper hatching out of, just go back to that previous slide, one of these tiny little things. And here's another one that's eating its way out of its eggshell.
So that's its head?
That's a big old head, yeah. All they kind of do is caterpillars is eat. They eat a lot. And they grow a lot too. And so just for reference, that they're not much bigger than Abe Lincoln's nose on the penny. These are the smallest animals we want to take care of at the zoo. Unlike Tony taking care of some of the biggest. And this has required a lot of experimentation on trying to figure out how to raise them. We're constantly working on optimizing this. And it's required a lot of trial and error. Both of these, well, that method we kind of have thrown out the door. That may have 1 or 2 caterpillars in it. We tried some free ranging where we put a bunch on there. This year we're trying to hybridize that and do 1 on a slightly bigger plant and seeing how they go. And that way we can keep track of every individual. We want to be able to maintain and know about female identity and where every individual is, so we can create a stud book, just like we do with tigers or any other animal we're breeding in the zoo. And I have to put a shout out to my very hard-working guy, my co-worker Caleb Nordmeyer. He's really been instrumental in getting all this figured out. Right there, he's actually looking for a caterpillar and nestled down inside that plant and seeing if it's still alive. Because one of the things we have to do is, unfortunately, we can't just like throw a leaf at them like we can like a monarch and just we'll watch it eat the leaf and then we know it's alive. With Dakota skippers, they build up a shelter. The caterpillars stitch together the pieces of the plant way down at the bottom of the plant, way down here, just about an inch above the soil. And they live inside a little tube that they made. And they poop in it, and they live there pretty much their entire caterpillar life in that tube. They might have to rebuild a new one if they feel, if it gets too full of poop, then they have to make a new one. But you don't know if they're alive until you start ripping the plant apart. We've tried a little more hands-on where we get a little bit more information about that, about whether they're alive or not, and so we can keep track of them, but we found that all that adds stress to them because they have to, as soon as you give them new food again and confirm that they're alive, the first thing they do is rebuild a shelter instead of eating. So they can lose out on a couple days of eating before starting to be happy again. So that adds some stress, and so we're trying to go more and more hands off. So again, it's optimizing lots of different factors. And here's another cute guy. So this is what they turn into a little bit later. This is kind of almost towards the end of the caterpillar life stage, but this is also Minnesota, and winter is coming. And it's always coming in Minnesota, right? And so what do you do when you're a butterfly like this? Well, you've got 2 options. One, you can be like a monarch and be wimpy and migrate south. I love monarchs. What they do is phenomenal, but they are wimps. They can't handle our winters. These guys are really hardy. They hibernate as a caterpillar, just about not much, maybe that big, half an inch long, on the ground in their plant. So they just stop eating right about now, once it starts getting cold, and their plants are starting to senesce, and then they just wait till spring. So that's one thing we have to figure out, is how to make them happy in the winter too. And especially when there's a lot of snow on the ground. So we've been trying to track that information and measuring snow depth and figuring out what are conditions underneath a foot of snow or under an inch of snow. And we found out the snow is a really important insulator for them. And even in the coldest winter we had, in a while, 2 years ago, the air temperature got to 23 degrees below zero, about this high off the ground. On the bottom of the snow at that very moment, it was 21 degrees above zero. So it's a tremendous insulator. We know it can do a lot for them, and we want to be able to juggle that. So we're trying a couple different methods there too. One is to try to keep some outside and let them just hang out under snow. We're going to try some more of that this year, but otherwise we've been keeping them in each one of these little tubes. That's a caterpillar butt, that's another caterpillar butt. Each tube has a caterpillar in it and labeled, so we know exactly who's who, and we can trace it back to that family history again. And then we put them in a dorm fridge, basically, and if you crank it to the coldest temperatures, it gets just below freezing, almost exactly the same temperatures you would see right underneath the snowpack. So we can kind of get lucky there. So this is the method we used mostly last year. We're going to mix it up a little bit, and this has been a pretty successful thing for us. And then summer comes, yay. And then we have to deal with the adults. And this has been one of the trickier parts, because in order to maintain a population long term, if we're going to be doing that, we need to be able to figure out how to mate them, and that's been one of the biggest moving targets for us. So this is the first male Dakota skipper we ever raised from egg to adult here at the zoo. This is the first female. This was in 2014. And then this is our first mating in 2014, and then this is a mating this year in 2015. And we've gotten really lucky. We've been pretty good at cracking the code on how to grade them all the way through, and now we've had, I think, at least 18 matings here this last year. So right now we've got about 600 caterpillars. We don't know if they're alive or dead or not. We call them Schrodinger's caterpillars again, because we don't know if they're alive until we open the box and see if they're there. But up to about 600. But ultimately, we don't want to just be thinking about them in a zoo environment. We want to be able to do what we're doing and be able to provide them back out into the wild and think about why they disappeared in the wild in the first place. So what we're doing could be part of a reintroduction program long term. And we also want to think about why they disappeared in the first place. Butterflies are very good indicators of environmental health. They're commonly used on a lot of different studies. And all of their really complex life cycle, they depend on different resources and different conditions at different times of year. It's really easy to break each one of these arrows. And that makes them very sensitive to environmental conditions. And so the fact that so many butterflies have been disappearing from our prairies so rapidly tells us that something is wrong with our prairies. And these are the prairies of the canary, you could say. Butterflies are very commonly used, like I said, as indicators in a lot of studies, and especially climate change studies. We know, for example, that butterflies are coming out earlier in the year on average. They're moving north or south away from the poles in terms of their ranges. And for those on the tops of mountains, they've got nowhere else to go. And as species are moving north, or moving into higher elevations where it's cooler. And one of the more dramatic examples of butterflies as indicators in the last few years was after the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, when there was the big radiation leak. A year after that, for a butterfly that has 2 generations a year, we were seeing some really crazy deformations going on at relatively low levels of radiation. So deformed eyes, weird spotting patterns that had never been seen before, extra limbs were showing up, kind of reminiscent of what was happening with Minnesota frogs a few decades ago. So some pretty dramatic evidence of environmental conditions changing, being expressed in butterflies first. So why did they disappear? Well, it's going to be a complex situation. We want to emphasize that. There's probably no one smoking gun. It's probably going to be a multifactorial piece, and it's going to be a local thing, because we've got lots of different island-like factors going on with prairies. And so it could be a lot of different things. It could be overuse of fire, it could be underuse of fire, it could be invasion of weeds, it could be small population size effects where you're just getting inbred with each other. Could be many, many different things. One of the factors that's been raised has been proximity to agriculture and potential drift from pesticides. And so for the last year, we've been working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They've provided us with some extra money, and we've been sampling grasses from the prairies, and then grasses from right along the edges. This is a site in southwest Minnesota that formerly had Dakota skippers, but they're now gone from. And so we've been collecting samples there and having them tested for pesticide residues. And we have found some. We don't really understand what the levels might be, and we have found drift for up to about a mile for some of the pesticides that are being applied for soybean aphids, but again, we don't know what the biological consequences are, given that at this time of the year, in mid to late August, the caterpillars are going to be down just an inch above the soil, and if any grasses or if any drift is occurring, it may be only in the top part and they're not exposed to it. We don't know what the consequences are, but it's been raised as a pretty significant concern. So that's ongoing work. Ultimately, though, we also want to be able to inspire and get out and think about long-term preservation of the prairies. So if we're good at one thing at the Minnesota Zoo, it's education also. And so again, this is my amazing coworker, Kale. He dressed up as a Dakota skipper last Halloween and got out in front of the public and started telling people about this little butterfly that I've never heard about, but tells a big story. And so then also what we're doing is, if you haven't seen it, but the east parking lot, around the east parking lot of the Minnesota Zoo, erupts in color in the summer because we've now planted that, we've replaced all that Kentucky bluegrass that had no sort of value of holding the soil like I showed you before, and we put in a bunch of prairie plants, and especially prairie flowers, and it is really, really popular with the pollinators, and it's really spectacular. And building in with that, we've a lot of other education about these butterflies and about prairie biology. So I encourage you, you don't have to even go and pay admission to the zoo, you can just come into that east parking lot anytime in the middle of summer and check it out. It's really quite amazing. The other thing now is what you can do. So it's going to be hard for you individually to save a Dakota skipper, besides giving us more money to be able to do more with them. That's a shameless plug, I admit. But what you can do in the backyard to help your own pollinators, we know bees are struggling, butterflies are struggling, is to be able to then plant for pollinators. And so check out this website, mnzoo.org/plant4pollinators. This is also linked off our Act for Wildlife page. And if you've got it in front of you, this purple flyer is modeled after that webpage. And there's two major lessons from that. So there's two flyers. There's one about getting to know butterflies in your yard. That's the yellow one. And then the purple one is Plant for Pollinators. There's two major messages from the Plant for Pollinators. One is avoid pesticides when you can, and when you know that they're there especially. We know, be very careful that there are some plants, especially sold at the larger stores, that have been applied with pesticides to discourage herbivory and make them look pretty when you buy them. But those can be expressing pesticides in, say, the nectar or the pollen, and that can be very detrimental to bees or to butterflies. So avoid pesticides whenever you can, especially if you're just going to be hand applying. And then also look for the native species, and we've got some great native plant nurseries in the area. There's a lot of them. And so in this guide, we've suggested a big range of potential plants for you to be using. Ultimately, what we want is to see these guys back out in the wild and mating. This is a wild pair of Dakota skippers. We want to see them out serving as pollinators in the environment. And we want to see them as food. We want to see them interacting in their environment. Maybe this is a depressing picture, seeing an endangered species being eaten, but that actually is very reassuring because it's kind of what we want to see. We want to see them a member of their ecosystem like they were. So this actually made me smile. I did, just for the science purpose, I did bother the spider a little bit, and I collected one of the legs for a DNA study that we're doing. So he got his meal and I got some data out of it at the same time. So with that, thank you, and I'm now going to hand it off to Tony Fisher. And should we do questions now? I think maybe we do questions at the end. Okay, we'll take one now.
Back on the monarch for a second.
Sure.
My neighbor planted the milkweed and she got cocoons, but then the milkweed was covered with aphids.
Yeah.
And then hornets and flies came and ate the cocoons. So how do you avoid that?
Yeah, that happened to me too. There's a yellow aphid. It's a non-native aphid. It's called the oleander aphid. And it can really decimate your plants, and then they're secreting this honeydew that attracts wasps and everything else to want to eat it. And then there'll be predators on everything else. So the best thing you can do is, if you see that aphid problem coming in, just cut off that part of the plant right away. And stomp on the ground.
There's no way to prevent it.
There are also some insecticidal soaps you can try to apply, but then you run the risk of hurting a caterpillar that might be on there at the same time. So the best thing to do is probably just try to, if you see an aphid, squish it. Yeah. We love animals, but sometimes they can be a problem. Okay, with that, I'll hand it off to Tony to talk about the big guys.
Okay, now we go from one of the smallest animals on the prairie to one of the biggest. Also depends on the prairie ecosystem, just like the butterflies do. And we know them as the bison. And they're also known as buffalo to many people, but really the true buffaloes are native to Asia and Africa. The American bison is native to North America. So really the correct name for this species is American plains bison. And we all know the story behind the bison. They were found across all of this country. Americans have loved this animal. We've loved them ever since Lewis and Clark first went across this country, 1803 to 1806, and they reported back in their journals and in their letters about bison so numerous across the plains that they numbered in the tens to hundreds of thousands. And they were right. The bison did number in large numbers across much of North America. In fact, estimates were that there were probably around 20 million to 60 million bison at one time across North America. And they range across all the grassland ecosystems across this continent. But it was the Americans that loved them, and it was also us that pretty much drove them almost to extinction. We kind of know that story with the massive slaughter of the bison across the plain states. That's a pile of skulls of bison. That's a pretty commonly used photo. They were harvested for skulls, for tongues, for hides. We pretty much slaughtered them just to kill also. And we drove this population of bison down from the high numbers of 20 million down to less than 1,000 animals. And that extinction of the bison across the prairies kind of opened up a new industry out there across American West for cattle. And cattle kind of moved in and took over where bison left off. And we kind of find that still remains today. A lot of cattle out there. And the railroads were instrumental in making this happen. They kind of opened up the transportation across the plain states, allowed people to move in and harvest bison, and they also allowed for the cattle to take over. And they moved the cattle from the southern states up to the great plain states, and then they shipped them out east for food. So the railroads were kind of instrumental in this whole process, but the cattle industry kind of took over where the bison left off. But thanks to some pretty key people at the time, they didn't let the bison go extinct. They were down to less than 1,000 animals, and a lot of people stood up and took notice of that, and thankfully they saved them from extinction. You know, they created Yellowstone National Park. Bison were held there, allowed to breed and reproduce normally. The Bronx Zoo was pretty instrumental in that whole process as well. They brought animals into the zoo and they bred them there, and then later they were released out into national parks. And also cattle ranchers were pretty instrumental in saving the species as well. They were concerned about them. Ranchers like Charles Goodnight, which was a huge cattle rancher at the time, he was helping save the bison, and he pulled bison into his ranches and allowed them to breed and to reproduce. And it's from their efforts, from those people, that we have the bison of today. Thankfully, they saved the species from extinction. And so we thought they were safe. There's a lot of bison out there now. It looks good. Our work is done. But as it turns out, it's really not, because while they were saving the bison from extinction, they kept a lot of these herds next to cattle herds, and there was some accidental crossing that took place between bison and cattle, but a lot of it was intentional as well. They were trying to create a better beef animal at the time, and it didn't really work. They didn't get a better beef animal, but what was left behind was a lot of cattle DNA within the bison genome. And as it turns out today, most of the bison out there today have cattle DNA present in them. So they're not the same bison that we found in this country in the early 1800s. They are different. And it's pretty obvious when you see a calf like that being born from a bison. There's obviously cattle DNA in that cow. That bison there has horns that look like more like a longhorn steer. Obviously cattle DNA there. But if you look at a bison like that, it looks like a bison. And it's hard to tell, is there cattle DNA or not? And most of them do have it. And it really doesn't matter. If they still look like bison, is that okay with us? Are we okay with the cattle DNA out there? And should we do anything about that? And as it turns out, they are different. This was a study done by Texas A&M in 2004 and 2009, and they had this Santa Catalina item with prairies out there, and they allowed the bison to exist naturally on these prairies, and they were able to test for cattle DNA within these bison. And over time, they weighed these bison, and the way it turned out was, in every case, the dark bars are the bison without cattle DNA, and the light bars are with. Every case, it showed that the bison with cattle DNA grew slower and ended up at a smaller size than the bison without cattle DNA. So it was affecting its species. This they proved that fact that it has changed the species with the cattle DNA. And there's a lot of conservationists of today that kind of noticed this and decided that we need to do something about this. It's not okay to have cattle DNA within our bison. Minnesota Zoo also took notice, and we partnered with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in 2012, and we formed a formal agreement to kind of work on our Minnesota bison. And with a couple of goals in mind. We want to eliminate all the cattle DNA, or as much as possible, from our bison herds in the state. And we want to preserve as much genetic diversity into the future as possible. So that people of this state can see bison the way they existed back in the 1800s. Well, the DNR already had a bison herd at Blue Mountain State Park when we started this agreement. They've had them there since probably the 1950s, and they manage about 75 to 100 animals on this state park, which is located down in the southwest corner of the state. It has about 530 acres of native prairie grassland. They manage it for the grasslands, and they have a fence around the entire perimeter. And the visitors kind of walk around the perimeter of the bison enclosure and can view the bison from the walking trail or from some viewing areas along the way. Well, as part of the process, they have to do an annual roundup out there every year, and this is necessary because without the natural predators of bison, like wolves and bears, they quickly overpopulate the park. So there has to be an annual roundup where they catch all the bison, they do medical testing, they treat them, they mark them, but all the surplus animals have to be sold off to try and get down to that carrying capacity for that prairie out there. So we use that opportunity to start some DNA testing on our breeding age animals for this bison herd. So the Minnesota Zoo was involved in that for about the past 5 years. And we've been taking blood samples out of all the breeding age animals and hair samples, and we submit them to the lab at Texas A&M. And this is a lab that's been doing a lot of genetic work on the bison genome, and they've been testing on a lot of the herds throughout the country. And they were able to give us some pretty good information from the samples we submitted. First of all, they told us exactly which bison had cattle DNA in them, and we were able to mark those and flag them, and we were able to remove them from the herd. So after about 5 years, we can say now that, from what we can tell from the tests we have right now, all the bison out there don't have cattle DNA from the tests that we have right now. And then also we got some really good information from this analysis on relatedness to the other herds out there in the national park system. Since Texas A&M also tests for all these national park herds, they have that information as well, and they could tell us that approximately 40% of our herd is related to Wind Cave National Park. And that coincides with the records of Blue Mountain State Park as well, because they got most of their animals from Wind Cave National Park. Same with the cluster from National Bison Range. A lot of animals related to that. So We also, a big goal of this bison conservation project is try to manage for genetic diversity as well. And if we were doing a really good job of managing for genetic diversity, all these slices of this pie would be pretty equal. And that's what we need to use as a goal here. When we go to select new bulls and bring in new genetics to this herd, we're going to look at this pie graph and we're going to see that, well, there's a pretty small slice there from Yellowstone National Park. That would be a good spot to go get some new bulls and bring into our herd. Same with Teddy Roosevelt National Park. That's going to be our future goal for the new bulls that we select in the next couple of years. Another tool that we use for managing genetic diversity within this bison herd is a stud book. And the zoo industry kind of uses stud books a lot. We have a lot of small populations of rare animals, and stud books are a good tool for us to manage the pedigrees and track the lineages of each individual animal. A lot of our rare animal populations are down to 20, 40, less than 100 animals within the zoo industry across the country. And so we use stud books quite a bit to track all these populations of rare zoo animals and try to manage the breeding and the genetics to try and create as much diversity for as long in the future as possible. So we kind of use the tools that we have for our rare animal stud books, we use it on the bison as well. And this is kind of a graph that is produced from this software, and it shows an age pyramid. And it kind of gives you a quick snapshot of the demography of your population. And you can see on the left is males, and on the right is females. And you know, in a really healthy population, this would be a nice triangular shaped graph. We don't have a lot of animals entered into this yet, so it will fill in over the years as we get more and more animals and more data into this stud book. But you can kind of see the females in this herd look pretty good. You know, there's a lot of young animals down at the lower end of this graph, and then as they get older, there gets to be less and less females. And you got a couple up here that are 22, 23 years old. Then on the left side, you got the males in blue, and you can see there's some young males out here, quite a few, and then all of a sudden, whoop, nothing there. Well, that's because at the annual roundup, they pretty much get rid of the males when they get to be breeding age. The park system in Blue Mountains, 500 acres, really not enough room to allow bulls to kind of move off and disperse on their own like you'd see in the wild or in a huge national park system. So we need to get them out of there, and that's kind of what's happening there. And there's a new breeding bull that they just brought in from Wichita Mountains National Wildlife Refuge. He's going to be the new breeder as he gets older, but that guy up there, that 20-year-old guy, that's the herd bull. And he's pretty much king out there, and he gets to take care of all these girls over here. That's a pretty good deal for him. But he doesn't know that guy's moving up, so he's going to take over eventually. So the stud book, it gives us a lot of good information. It allows us to track the lineage of all these animals, and as we work towards tracking pedigrees and doing DNA analysis on individual calves, we're going to get more and more refined with our stud book and be able to do a better job in managing genetic diversity over time. So I mentioned that we use that pie graph to find new bulls, and in 2013, the slice that was from Badlands National Park was pretty small, and so we use that information to go and seek out a new bull for the Minnesota Zoo from Badlands National Park. And what we did was they also do an annual roundup, or about every 2 years they do a roundup, and they don't catch all their bison, but they catch a portion of them, move them into pens, and they do their testing, and then they surplus out bison to, I think, one of the Native American tribes in South Dakota. Well, we use that opportunity to get a new bull, and so we asked them to catch a bull for us, but we wanted to make sure we got a bull without cattle DNA, so we had them catch 5, and we tested them all for cattle DNA, submitted samples to Texas A&M before we even went out there. And what the neat part was that Texas A&M also tests our bison, so they were able to tell us exactly which bull was least related to our cows. And so we were able to pick the best bull for our herd. And that, by the way, that's the park. It's 250,000 acres. It's a huge park if you've ever been out there. And the bison act pretty wild. They don't get too close to people. That's not the bull. That's actually the only bison I got close enough to take a picture when I went out there. That's him right there. And he was one of 5, and we backed the trailer up to load them. And these bison are wild. They've never seen trailers or trucks, been close to pens or anything, you know, and they're not too happy about it. But we backed to load them up, and you know, we ran him in the trailer, and he was pretty mad. He ended up banging the trailer up and put a horn through the roof of the trailer, putting holes in. So we had to get rolling pretty quick here, and then he settled down and he did all right. But the welders at the zoo were not too happy with me when I got back to that trailer. It was pretty full holes. Well, we got him back to the zoo, and we ran him through our quarantine station and checked him for diseases and parasites. And after he was clean, he got to move up to our herd, and that's the bull out there right now. That's with our cows. And there's a couple of calves that were born from that bull in 2013. And we had a couple more born in 14, and I think we had 3 born this year. And every year after, I think we're going to have about 4 calves born a year here at the zoo. And as part of our agreement with the DNR, everything born at the Minnesota Zoo gets taken to a Minnesota State Park at between 1 and 2 years of age. So we manage about 12 bison on our exhibit. It's only about 6 acres. If we got any more bison than that, it would look pretty beat up. So 12 is about our carrying capacity. And you know, they're on exhibit during the day, and then we bring them into this holding area at night. Like most zoo animals are managed, we bring them into a holding area at night so we can, you know, get a good handle on their diet and treat them if we need to, and work on the exhibit. This holding area was kind of renovated in 2013, so it's all pretty brand new. The pronghorn up in there at night, but we got some pretty large herd pens in place there, and then we also got this restraint chute that the bison have to walk through every day to go onto exhibit. So most days, you know, they just walk through it and then they go on exhibit, and everything's great. But once in a while, when we need to catch them and we need to do some medical treatment or load them and take them somewhere, it's really easy to do that with the restraint chute in place. So that was put in there to kind of help us manage our bison for this project. Works pretty well. We also added a new herd to the bison conservation project just this past September at Minneopa State Park near Mankato. This park was chosen because it had a nice prairie grassland area within it, but it also was close to a large metro area, Mankato and Minneapolis-St. Paul. So a lot of people can enjoy this park and enjoy the bison, and that's one of the reasons why this park was chosen to add bison this year. And so the Minnesota Zoo has been involved in the reintroduction of bison within this park this past year. We've been advising on animal management and fencing, and that's Eric's butterfly car, which is used for bison now too. Thanks to Eric for letting us use that. And you can see that the park is about 330 acres of grassland, and then the DNR put a fence around the entire perimeter, and they added some enclosures on one end to manage the bison if needed. Eventually we'll have to do a round up there as well, and those will help for that. I think there's a pond being added somewhere in this area this next year. But what makes Minneopa different from Blue Mountain State Park is that it's got a road that runs right through the middle of it. And park visitors will be able to drive through that bison enclosure and see bison just like they can at Custer State Park and Yellowstone National Park. So that's one thing that will be unique to this park in Minnesota and to many parks. You'll be able to drive right through with the bison. So this past year, a lot of work was done out there. They got grant money from the LCCMR again, and they brushed out the perimeter, put in a wildlife-friendly fence, which is this 5 strands of high tensile wire. It's designed to allow the bison to stay in, but also allow wildlife to pass through, deer to jump over, and other wildlife to get through the park without getting entangled. They also did a lot of grassland improvement. A lot of the prairie is being taken over by sumac and other woody vegetation, so they did some burning and mowing out there. That will continue through the years. They added automatic waters because the bison need to drink year-round, so we need to add that in one end. And then in this next year, they're going to add a restraint and enclosures for the bison to be able to work with a roundup. So this past September, 21st to the 25th, we took 11 bison and released them out to that state park. 3 of them came from the Minnesota Zoo, and 8 came from Blue Mountain State Park. When we first took them out there, we released them in those small pens up on that one end of the park. They're 1-acre pens, and we did that for a couple of reasons. Since the bison were coming from 2 different herds, we want to make sure they get along with each other first, get acclimated to the group, and then get acclimated to the fencing and to the basic park in Minneopa. And then once they were acclimated and everyone was getting along good, then we released them out into the park. So there's a little video of the zoo dropping off the bison, R3 that came there. I don't have any sound with it, but that's our head vet right there. He's saying, now, should I get out of the way? Yeah. There they come. Now that's the first three bison to walk on that ground since about 1830s. And if you remember those 2 calves that I showed you earlier on the slide, that's them. So in 1 to 2 years, they grow pretty fast. I don't think that they care that they're the first bison since 1830s. They're just more happy getting out of that trailer and eating some grass. So that was our 3 females, and a couple days later, Blue Mountain State Park brought 8 females from their herd and put them in with ours, and made sure they're getting along okay. And a couple days later, we actually opened the gate and let them out into the big park. And when we first opened the gate, it took about an hour really for them to actually figure out the gate was open. And then we thought that they would hang around and eat grass for a while, and no, they took off running. And as soon as that gate was open, they got through it. They ran actually down to the other end of the park. And we never seen them again. No, they're still there. They're still there. The DNR is gonna make sure that the bison learn this entire enclosure and get acclimated to everything, and then eventually they're gonna open it up to park visitors, which mid-October-ish, somewhere around there, that they'll actually open the gates and let people drive through and see them. And that's them, a couple days ago, out in the park, enjoying the grasslands, enjoying the prairie. There's 3 of these cows are pregnant, so there will be some calves born next spring out there already. Probably this next summer, we're going to look at getting a new bull for out there. So we'll be looking at one of those national herds, probably to place a bull out there, Yellowstone or Teddy Roosevelt Park, and they'll start to breed. And I think the idea here is they're going to probably grow this population to about 30 to 40 animals, and that's what they figure that prairie can support year-round. The idea here is to have them to just survive on prairie grass and not to have to feed them. So they'll keep that herd at about 30 to 40 animals. So that's where we're at. We've got 3 herds now in our bison conservation program. We've got at the Minnesota Zoo with about a dozen. We've got Blue Mountain State Park, and now we got Minneopa State Park. So roughly we're at capacity of about 150 animals. That's still not a secure population. You need to really have about 500 bison within a herd to be able to manage that genetic diversity and keep it long term. So the DNR is looking at adding a few more state parks in the upcoming years. Don't know where they're going to be at yet, but they're going to be adding them and bringing them online. We're also looking for other partners, Native American tribes, other government organizations that are looking to work with bison conservation, try to add them into our conservation herd and work towards the same goals. We're also going to be bringing in new bulls every 3 to 5 years and working with the National Park System on that. And we've started now tracking pedigrees of the calves. We'll be able to tell exactly who the mother is with DNA analysis, and we'll be able to do a much better job of managing that stud book and really fine-tuning genetic diversity into the long run. And we're going to continue to cooperate with the national herd programs out there. They all have the same goal that we do, but they have much more land, they have more bison, they can't catch them every year. It's going to take them a lot longer to get to the stage that we're at right now. And I think somewhere down the line they're probably going to be coming to us to get new genetics, because we're going to have a much better handle on it than they can possibly do in the short term. With the goal that, that we want the bison to be the same. the same as when they were in the 1800s. We want them to be the same well into the future and beyond, so that Lewis and Clark, the same bison they seen, can be the same bison that our people see now and our kids and well into the future. Same species. That's the goal. And I think we're well on our way. And it's going to take some work, and it's going to be a continual project well into the future, but I think everyone has been real positive in working with this project, and a lot of good players with the DNR, with the Minnesota Zoo, and many others out there that kind of working as a big team to get this done, and it's working. Any questions? Ooh. Yes, sir.
What, if anything, is being done with the bison that were crossbred?
Yeah, the bison that we found that were crossbred with cattle DNA, they were sold at public auction. I mentioned that Blue Mountains is a public auction every year. They have to do that. You know, Yellowstone National Park doesn't have to do this because you have wolves and bears. They keep the bison population at carrying capacity on their own. But without wolves and bears out there, they're going to overgrow their space pretty fast. So we have to take some animals out every year. And so the way the DNR does it at Blue Mountains, and whether they're going to continue to do it at all the other state parks, is to offer those bison up to the public to buy. And that's where those bison went.
So I suppose that bison burgers that you find in some restaurants could be crossbred with.
They probably are, yeah. And like I said, most of the bison out there in the country right now have cattle DNA, the vast majority. Yep. Yes, sir.
What about commercial bison farms? Is anything being done to watch genetics or diversity in those, or are there a lot of bison farms? You see them now and then.
Most of the bison in the country today are in private farms. I don't think they are as concerned about cattle DNA within their population. They're concerned with growing meat. It's kind of an ag industry right now. You know, the cattle DNA probably doesn't affect them as much as it would a wild species. So I don't think that they are going to be as concerned about it as the National Park System and the Minnesota Zoo and the State Park System.
Are there quite a few commercial farms throughout the United States?
There's a lot. There's a lot. The vast majority of bison in the country today are in private farms. Yeah. Yeah. You know, and they're concerned about raising a product for meat, and that's okay. We're concerned with keeping a species looking like it has over hundreds of thousands of years and keeping it the way natural selection has made that species. That's our goal. Anybody else? Yeah.
So the ones that are going to that, is it Minneopa?
Yeah, Minneopa.
So all those cows that are out there are genetically free of cattle DNA?
That's correct. Yep. They came from Blue Mountains and from the Minnesota Zoo, and all the bison that we have in our herds right now are free of cattle DNA as far as we can tell. Now, I should say that the test that they use for checking for cattle DNA looks at the segment of DNA where cattle DNA is most likely to be present. They don't check the whole DNA strand. And right now, there is a project at Texas A&M where they are decoding the entire bison genome. And that's a year or two away. But when they do that, they will be able to offer a test to us that will look at the entire DNA and tell us for sure. And when that's available, we're going to use it. And we may find out that we've got cattle DNA in our bison that we never knew we had. And then we're just going to work at eliminating like we had before. And eventually get them to be without.
So that bull that you brought, that put all the holes in there, he's not down there, is he?
He's at the zoo.
Okay, so I was gonna say, could I use your vehicle to go around? Because he might remember that vehicle.
He might go to Minneopa. We'll have to look at the genetics and see what the best match for those cows are. But yeah, you know, they're wild. Yeah.
So at Minneopa, it's mostly prairie land, and I know that usually needs fire to maintain. Can the bison grazing help maintain it in a prairie state without having other stuff move in?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole intent with the DNR. They're doing it at Blue Mountains right now with the 530 acres. They're keeping it as native prairie, just with bison. And that's the intent with Minneopa as well, is to keep it looking like a native prairie and being a native prairie as close as possible with a native prairie species like the bison.
Do you have to do as much burning when the native species are in their grade or greatest?
There probably will be some burning. I mean, in the past, there were prairie wildfires that took place. It kind of,
That's what kept them prairie.
it kept the woody vegetation out, and there probably will be some management like that that will occur over time. And that's why they used steel fence posts for a lot of their bison enclosures, so they could do the burning.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep, yep.
So are there plans to introduce wolves to Minnesota to help with keep the bison herds healthier?
Well, we have lots of wolves already in Minnesota, but not at the state parks, no. That habitat is not large enough to support a pack of wolves. It would never work. But there's lots of wolves. If you go in northern part of Minnesota, you know that we've got a healthy population of wolves up there, and they're surviving on deer and everything else. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
How does the wood bison get different than from the prairie bison?
It's a different subspecies, and I think it's a little larger, but I don't know all the differences. I know, Diana, do you know how the wood bison differs?
Their head is bigger, they're taller at the hump. If you put them next to each other, it's very obvious, but if you were just driving by a pen, and 5 miles later you drove past another one, you wouldn't probably catch the difference. But when I worked in Alaska and we had them not very far apart, you could see the males definitely get a lot broader. But and the woodland bison tend to eat more scrub. They don't need a prairie grass to keep going. They'll pretty much eat anything in their way that's vegetation and keep going.
Thank you. And Diana Weinhardt has been really a big player in this whole bison project ever since we started. She's in charge of the bison herd here at the Minnesota Zoo as well as the Northern Trail. So, thank you, Diana. Yes, sir.
When will we find out when Minneopa State Park will be open to the public for?
I would check the DNR website. They'll probably announce it there. A lot of it's going to depend on the bison and how they're doing. They're going to make sure that they're comfortable out there before we introduce cars, and they may do a trial run of just cars through there for a few days with more controlled basis to see how they react. And we want to make sure the bison are comfortable with the traffic going through before they open it up to the general public. But they kind of were guessing at mid-October, but I would check the DNR website or call Minneopa State Park, and you could probably get the most accurate update.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is a question for Eric. There was one of the slides showed some mutated butterflies in the Fukushima accident. Were those butterflies in Japan or were they in Minnesota?
Oh yeah, good question. Those mutated butterflies were not in Minnesota. They were even in the U.S. or North America. They were in Japan. They were within, I think it was about 15 miles of the reactor. It was at a level where people could technically be living at, so it was deemed to be a relatively safe level for people, but it was close enough that clearly radiation was occurring. Yeah. Another question?
Is there anything that can be done to meld your two projects together in some of these parks? Because obviously you're interested in the plant life and the smallest, and then he's interested in the largest, and can there be work done together so you both are able to achieve the same objective?
Yeah, it's a great question. Since we both are very interested in long-term stability of the prairies, as long as we could ever find the ability to get out there, we would like to do a parallel butterfly survey of the area of Minneopa. It gets a little harder for running around with a butterfly net when you've got a 1,000-pound bison next to you. I'm not sure quite feasibly how that happens, but Minneopa is just outside the range of Dakota skippers and Poweshiek skipperlings. They might have been there. We don't know historically. It's right on the sort of the historic edge of the range. We would like, certainly, yeah, we are interested in a lot of the same abilities to restore and enhance prairie. And if I think I've failed to mention this, one thing you can be doing to help protect the prairie is to support the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan. It's a long-term, multi-decade program in partnership with the DNR and Fish and Wildlife Service and Nature Conservancy, and especially private landowners, and encouraging and trying to connect those dots of those little fragments and work on prairie restorations. And it's a big collaborative effort, but it requires a lot of on-the-ground help by everybody. And so, write with legislators and be able to support them and encourage them to be able to support those programs and enhance the prairies. And those incentive programs especially are huge. In terms of being able to put bison out in the landscape, a lot of it is depending on having the ability to formally fence something off, so that they're not straying off onto somebody's cornfield or something. And so most of that has to be done in a state park side kind of a setting already. We have done surveys around the edges of Blue Mountain State Park in the last couple of years. When we first came on, we surveyed kind of those right outside the fence line, and those are known spots for, I think, at least Poweshiek skipperling and maybe Dakota skipper too. We didn't find any there. They probably were gone there in the last decade though. So in terms of overlap, yeah, we have a lot of things in common. There's some technical hurdles to being able to be able to totally do it at the same spot. But hey, if we're going to be doing reintroductions, depending on how the federal management prescriptions go for these butterflies, hey, who knows? We could be using the Neopa as a test case. So, good question. Other questions?
Well, how much area do you need to sustain a butterfly population?
How much area do we need for these little butterflies? Well, unlike a monarch that can handle a big area and get around to different pieces, these are real homebodies, and they're perfectly happy to spend their entire life in an area the size of the tropics building. So if the prairie is good enough, they actually don't leave, which is a nice thing to have, but it also adds the risk of a disaster taking them all out. And so that's one that we're trying to get around at the same time. So yeah, good question.
As weather patterns have changed here in Minnesota, I mean, obviously, we all know the horror stories of like the 30s of, deep snow, but recently, in the last, 20 years, since I moved up here, barely any snow. Is that a contributing factor?
Yeah, we like snowy years from the butterfly perspective. People may groan about it, but that's when we know that they've got good insulation for these caterpillars that are sitting on the ground. Otherwise, they're going to be, if we have these increasing periods where we have more intermittent or lower snowpacks, we could be still hit with sub-zero temperatures with very little snow on the ground. And we don't actually know what the lower lethal limit is for butterflies, for these Dakota skippers and Poweshiek skipperlings, in terms of how cold can they get without dying. We know that they can go to freezing and probably close to zero without dying from ice crystals forming in their body, but we don't know how long-term exposure that can be. And we certainly also worry about snow is going to keep the humidity up where they are, and if Minnesota winters get really, really dry, and so if they don't have an insulating snow cover pack, those butterflies can just basically get freeze-dried and just wrinkle up and die without the snow. So yeah, that's a really serious concern, and one thing we would like to be able to get information on long-term is what sort of habitat management could we use to figure out how to maintain a better snowpack. So can we do a burn late in the year and maintain the snowpack? Or can we mow a piece of prairie, which some of these prairies are managed for hay. Some of the tribal prairies in South Dakota are actually, they're hay prairies, and towards the end of summer they come through and mow the top of the prairie. And that's actually it's just fine for the butterflies. The Dakota skippers, again, they're just about an inch off the ground. If they're taking off the top 2 feet of the grass, they're actually fine. But is that going to leave enough snow or enough sort of upward stubble to hold on to snow? We don't know in a lot of these cases. So yeah, good question. It's a very serious concern for us long term, and it probably would impact which sites we do introductions to if we're going to be doing that. And my sort of like, well, you know, the southern sides are just getting too hot and they're not having enough snow long enough. Do we need to help them get north?
Within the past few years, aspergillus has become a really big problem for asters and rudbeckia and echinacea. How do the infected plants affect the butterflies that are trying to feed on them?
Good question. Yeah, we probably don't know much
Do they
about.
still feed on it?
They might skip it. Yeah, so if a plant is not going to be able to provide the resource, then it's not going to be able to be good for the butterfly either. But we probably just don't have the data in terms of for those guys. For Dakota skippers, their absolute favorite adult nectar plant is coneflower, and as you probably saw, most of or all my pictures of Dakota skippers are them sitting on purple coneflowers in the wild. And then, you know, the caterpillars. This is little blue stem, which is a fabulous native plant. What I love about this is that it's blue in the summer and it turns red in the winter. And so right now these flowering seed stalks are turning red, and you can just get this real big splash of color right in the middle of snow when you're needing color in the middle of winter. So actually the University of Minnesota is really pushing these as a horticultural plant. And they're planted right out in front of the football stadium at the University of Minnesota.
Well, at least that's a winner.
Yeah, it's a good plan, yeah. That one. Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Question about the bison. I know that there was talk that because the winters have been so mild, that it wasn't killing off parasites off of the moose. So that might have been the reason why the population was kind of having problems. So I didn't know if like does the same thing happen with the bison where they have parasites on them. Do you need a really cold winter to kill off, and if it doesn't, then it's dangerous to the population?
Yeah, I guess we haven't noticed that in the bison and all. In, you know, in the DNR herds and in our herds here, we can get our hands on the bison, and you know, we put them in those restraint chutes, and you know, we get diseases, we get parasites once in a while, and we just treat them individually. But I don't think we've noticed anything that kind of correlates with mild winters. It's kind of normal bison or cattle type parasites.
Do you know, in the bigger herds like in Yellowstone or Custer, is cattle DNA in those prevalent, or?
Yellowstone is probably the purest herd out there in the country today because they separated the bison off initially, and that park helped save the bison as a species. So the cattle never really got close to the Yellowstone herd. So it is probably one of the purest out there. But all the other herds out there do have some cattle DNA in them as far as what we've been checking. And they're in the process of weeding them out and getting them out the same as we are. Just it's going to take them a lot longer because they can't catch them all. And it's going to take many, many, many years. So, but the Yellowstone is probably the purest of the bison right now. Any other questions? All right, thank you.